Alright, this is the video for the 7.02 lesson, The Changing West. The census of 1850 listed 76,000 farms west of the Mississippi. By 1900, there were more than 1 million. Farmers were the last group to venture west, but west they went, perhaps heeding 19th century journalist Horace Greeley's saying, "Go west, young man." They took advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862 and the opening of the Oklahoma Territory in 1889. Settlements and farms snaked along railroads, rivers, and wagon routes, staying close to water in the dry plains. Today you'll read about the many hardships these pioneers faced as they helped fill out America's last frontier. Goals for this lesson: describe the beginnings of the timber and oil industries in the West, recognize the effects of new industries and increased population on the environment, describe life for most families on the plains, where they lived, and the hardships they faced. Don't forget to go to lesson resources, get your reading guide and or lesson answer key, and then we'll move on to reading pages 469 through 475. Okay, 469 we read about cattle as big business. Today we're starting at timber in the Pacific Northwest. In the 19th century, Americans relied on wood. Houses, furniture, wagons, fences, railroad ties, even city sidewalks were made from lumber. By the time of the Civil War, loggers had stripped the forests of New England bare and moved into the pines of Michigan and Wisconsin. As the nation expanded across the continent, its hunger for timber only grew. Railroads demanded wood for tracks and fuel. The mining industry needed beams to support its underground tunnels. Oregon and Washington were covered by forests of stout evergreens. The first loggers from New England arrived in Oregon in 1850s. In the next decade, timber farms around the country set up shop in the Pacific Northwest. Before the transcontinental railroads were completed, most wood went to California and some by sea to Asia and South America. But once railroads penetrated the Pacific Northwest, the western lumber industry competed in the Midwest and the East with that of the Great Lakes. Oil in Texas. In the late 1800s, new developments in industry and transportation demanded fuel, which made oil a valuable commodity. One of the West's most valuable resources, oil was not yet discovered until late in the 19th century because it lurked far beneath the surface of the land. In the 1890s, geologists and speculators discovered large underground oil reservoirs in California, Kansas, Texas, and Indian Territory. Commercial oil drilling promptly followed. By 1900, the West produced 9% of the nation's petroleum. Anthony Lucas, a geologist, was convinced that oil existed beneath the salt domes in southeast Texas along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. He leased some land near Beaumont, Texas, and began to drill. For years, his wells came up empty. On January 10, 1901, his drilling team was working on a salt dome called Spindletop Hill when they noticed mud bubbling up from their well. Suddenly, at 10:30 a.m., 6 tons of metal drilling pipe shot out of the ground. As the workmen fled, a 6-inch wide column of oil spurted 200 feet in the air. By the time Lucas and his men got to the gusher under control on January 19th, it was spewing forth 100,000 barrels of oil a day. Lucas's discovery attracted the last major wave of fortune seekers in the West. Beaumont's population quintupled within months. By 1902, Spindletop Hill was home to 285 active wells. More than 500 small companies opened offices in Beaumont, including companies that would become giants of the American petroleum industry, Gulf Oil Corporation, Texaco, and others. Derricks and drills lined the Gulf Coast. The Texas cities of Houston and Port Arthur flourished as centers of oil refining. The nation's petroleum production more than tripled in the first decade of the 20th century. Effects on the environment. The western frontier drew settlers and fortune seekers to the prospect of abundance, an abundance of land, timber, cattle, gold, oil, and other resources. 19th century Americans believed the continent's natural resources were inexhaustible. But even as early as the end of the Civil War, hunters in the West began noticing that streams once filled with trout were now empty, and woodlands once overflowing with game now seemed deserted. By the end of the 1800s, the march of settlement and commerce across the North American continent took its toll on the environment. The livestock of the large commercial ranches chewed the native grasses down to bare soil. Industry left scars on the western landscape. Oil gushers created pools of petroleum that seeped into soil and water or caught fire and created giant plumes of black smoke. Miners washed blast debris out of their tunnels with high-pressure water jets, clogging rivers and streams with tons of mud and rock. When the labor leader Bill Haywood visited the Anaconda copper mine in the late 19th century, he noted the desolation of the country. There was no greenery of any kind. It had all been killed by the fumes and smoke in the piles of the burning ore. Mine owners also dumped mercury, a toxic metal used to separate quartz from gold, into streams that fed larger bodies of water. Fish in the San Francisco Bay continued to be poisoned by 19th century mercury today. The timber industry inflicted the most obvious damage on the western landscape. Loggers bought huge areas of old-growth forests from state and federal governments and then proceeded to strip the land for lumber. Ancient redwoods and firs fell on the Oregon and Washington coast to be sent downstream to sawmills and cut into planks and boards. By the end of the 19th century, scientists warned that deforestation might lead to drought, soil erosion, and floods on major waterways, not to mention a scarcity of building materials. In 1901, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act, which allowed the President to declare any tract of forested public land off limits to settlement. The Forest Reserve Act marked the beginning of a revolution in land use. Instead of granting vast tracts to businesses and settlers, the federal government acted to preserve land in a growing network of national parks and forests. By 1907, various presidents had established 159 national forests, totaling 150 million acres. Life on the western farms. During the last 3 decades of the 19th century, American farmers settled 430 million acres, more land than it had in the 3 preceding centuries. The census of 1950 listed only 76,000 farms beyond the Mississippi. By 1900, there were more than 1 million. Settlements snaked along railroads, rivers, and wagon routes, tending to stay close to water in the dry plains. Farmers were the last group to venture westward across the Mississippi. Like miners, cowboys, and loggers who preceded them, they were a diverse mix. Swedish immigrants headed for Minnesota and Washington, Germans for Texas, and former slaves for Kansas. Much of the settlement of the Great Plains was prompted by the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed any American over the age of 21 to file a claim for up to 160 acres of public land. More than 500,000 families took advantage of the Homestead Act to start their own farms. The government ultimately gave away 285 million acres, an area the size of France, Germany, and Great Britain. Combined. Most 19th century homesteaders claimed land in Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakota. About 67,000 settled in Dakota between 1801 and 1885 alone. Even so, only 1 in 6 acres of government land in the American West was given to homesteaders. The most desirable land was already owned by the railroad lines. Between 1850 and 1871, Congress granted 181 million acres of public land to railroads, making them America's largest landowners. The railroads financed their expansion through the sale of some of their land to would-be settlers. The railroads sold the land at a much higher price than the government would have imagined. Speculators, too, rushed to turn a profit on public land. They bought huge tracts from rail lines or state governments, which they then offered to settlers at up to 10 times the original price. Small farmers had to make a choice: buy expensive land from railroads or speculators, or take free homesteads far from the tracts they relied on to bring their products to market. Many settlers came to resent the power and influence of the railroad companies, which controlled the best land. Most farmers did not make more than $250 a year, so for many, buying a farm at $10 an acre on top of the expense of moving west was impossible. These impoverished pioneers tried to make the best of what they had, which often proved challenging on barren soil 50 miles or more from the nearest transportation. The Exodusters. As Reconstruction drew to a close in the 1870s, the South's former slaves struggled to earn a living. Denied wages for centuries, they lacked wealth to buy land. Many hoped for a better life in the West. Benjamin Singleton, a former slave from Tennessee, began a black farmers' colony in Kansas, which he advertised widely through the South. Rumors spread among black Southerners that the government was giving ex-slaves plots of land in Kansas. Between 20,000 and 40,000 Exodusters, a nickname recalling the Hebrew Exodus from Egypt, journeyed to Kansas in 1879. They arrived in wagons, boats, and even on foot. Blacks established 40 towns in the Great Plains and bought 20,000 acres of land in Kansas. But for many, the West did not fulfill their hopes. The arid conditions of the plains made farming difficult. After a string of failed harvests, many blacks moved east. Here's a picture of a cabin, a makeshift cabin on a claim. Those who remained often confronted the same racist policies they had hoped to leave behind in the South. States from Kansas to Oregon enacted laws that segregated blacks and limited their voting privileges and economic activity. Opening Oklahoma. By the late 1890s, the northern Great Plains were overflowing with settlers. Seeking additional land, homesteaders pressured the government to open the 2 million acres in Oklahoma Territory. Since the 1830s, this land had been set aside by Congress as Indian Territory. But faced with a dwindling frontier and increased pressure from homesteaders, in 1889, President Benjamin Harrison agreed to open Oklahoma to settlement. On the morning of April 22, 1889, as many as 100,000 people lined up along the southern border of Kansas and the northern border of Texas. Carriages, wagons, horses, carts, and bicycles crowded wheel to wheel. In Arkansas City, Kansas, 15 southbound trains waited in the station with cars jammed so full that passengers perched on roofs and platforms. At noon, gunshots, cannons, and trumpets sounded, and the crowd surged forward. By order of President Harrison, the Oklahoma Territory was opened to settlement on a first-come, first-served basis. By dusk, every blade of grass had been claimed. Some settlers had occupied land in Oklahoma even before Harrison opened the territory. Some of these Sooners, as they were called, which is why Oklahoma has the nickname the Sooner State, had entered the region legally, including marshals, mail carriers, government officials, and railroad men. Others sneaked in illegally to secure a good homestead. These settlers who rushed into the region on April 22, 1889, called boomers after the gunshots and cannons that signaled the opening of the territory, complained that the best land had already been taken by the Sooners. Hardships of farming the plains. Farming on the Great Plains demanded 14-hour workdays from every able family member. On each new farm, hundreds of acres of virgin sod had to be cleared, tilled, plowed, and planted. In the decades during which the plains were settled, new inventions helped farmers work the land. Mechanical harrows, improved plows, mowing and harvesting machines, and threshers and binders more than half the number of hours required to produce a bushel of corn or wheat. Still, for a Western farm to succeed, every member of the family had to pull his or her own weight. A huge burden of labor fell on wives. Women mended and sewed, milked the cows, churned the butter, and cooked and cleaned without the aid of running water. They also looked after the children and helped with field work during busy times. To prepare the land for planting, farmers cut the native tall grasses and broke up the dense soil beneath. Unfortunately, this stripped the ground of its natural defenses. The soil now had nothing to hold it together or shield it from the bitter, dry winds that swept the plains. When the rains ended, the naked topsoil baked in the sun. A single gust of wind could carry away tons of once fertile ground in a cloud of dust, leaving behind acres of parched, barren desert. Settlers quickly learned that every season on the plains brought its own dangers. Scorching summer heat waves, dried streams, killed livestock, and kindled destructive prairie fires. Winter brought fierce blizzards that buried cattle and pushed snow through every crevice in a house. Most devastating of all, however, were the grasshopper invasions. Year after year in the mid-1870s, mile-wide swarms descended suddenly from spring skies, blotting out the sun and smothering the grasslands under a dense, twitching blanket of billions of insects. Once they landed, the grasshoppers ate everything: crops, roots, tree leaves, and bark, leather harnesses, clothes and closets, the wooden handles of tools, and even each other. Such a host of insects I never saw, a Kansas homesteader wrote. The ground is completely covered and the branches of the trees are bending down with their weight. 30 acres of wheat, which looked beautiful and green in the morning, is eaten up. 640 acres, 2 miles south of me, that was looking fine at the beginning of the week, looks this morning as though a fire has passed over it. Farming in dry country. The Western Plains, actually I'm going to stop here, farming in dry country, and I'm going to begin on the next video with this paragraph, because we're almost to the end of the 15-minute limit. So we'll stop here and start shortly.